The Galactic Union was a relatively new idea. After crossing the galactic center, the void that everyone called it, where there was nothing more than simple stars and a few scattered gas giants, but nothing else, no life, you found on what is known as the Galactic West a group of different species that would group together for their own safety. This was due to the overwhelming threat of potentially one of the more formed empires reaching out across the dead zone, the void of the center of the universe, and conquering those on the other side. So, strength in numbers, of course. And for a while, everything held. But as they fought off a few small attacks that didn't seem to apply much, it seemed as though those more towards the capital of the Galactic Union started to think that they should be in charge more and more. This was more evident as they reached out with more laws and more regulations to make sure that the other planets did nothing but bring wealth and prosperity to the core worlds, though saying they were core worlds is a bit misleading. The fact of the matter is these quote unquote core worlds were far on the outskirts of the Union territory. So much so that they had to actually move their capital towards a different planet. Along with that, there was another one that was much closer to the center, which was relatively just a city. In fact, they had to make artificial oxygen scrubbers to make sure that many of the species didn't simply pass out and die the moment they entered this planet. This was one of the key features of the new Galactic Union, as their commerce was growing exponentially, and it was reaching out as well. But what they did not like was that several of the newer, younger species would begin to trade with the older empires and not trade with the Galactic Union. This, in turn, would make the younger races more profitable, able to bring in more resources, more technologies, and definitely just more. That was cutting out the core worlds and the government itself. If the younger species were beginning to trade without the Galactic Union, the Galactic Union core worlds would become less and less wealthy, less and less powerful, and they could not possibly let that happen. So more and more laws and regulations were put towards the younger races, trying to make sure that they would maintain themselves in the Galactic Union. They would be brought to heel. This eventually turned into a set of tariffs, along with taxes. The taxes, though not very high, was simply something that everyone paid attention to, but didn't really care much. The tariffs, however, were spiked up to the point where it was almost economically infeasible to trade with anybody else except the core worlds of the Galactic Union. This infuriated the younger races, who decided to simply ignore the tariffs eventually. They would tell the Galactic Union in no uncertain terms that they would not take any of their new laws seriously. They would stand in defiance of them if they had to. If they were simply trying to sink the economies of all these new races, for what? So that they could push their own bulbous selves onto everyone else? This was not going to fly. The only thing slowing down the core worlds is that a young species, known to everyone as human, was a bit dangerous. Yet it was only one species. What made them dangerous to everyone is the fact that they stood approximately 40% taller than what's known as galactic standard. However, they only did have two extra appendages on the upper body and two for locomotion. This made them almost a laughingstock to the most of the species. However, it was still a worry, as they tend to be very, very strong, along with being big, and surprisingly fast for their size. But again, it was one species. And who only cared about one species when there was 24 other species in the Galactic Union that would be able to be brought to heel? With this, those in charge of the core worlds continued to push as hard as they could until those on the outskirts could no longer take it. They told the core worlds that they would no longer be dealing with any type of regulation without representation. They would no longer stand by and let any of this happen. And that is when the core worlds simply laughed in unison. They told all the rest that the taxes would be increased, and if they could not pay the taxes in resources, then they, as a species, would begin to become slaves, and they would have to sell off their own people to pay for their own planet. This came down to a total of 5 different species becoming completely enslaved by the core worlds. And that was the spark. That was the lit match thrown into a room filled with gasoline that was going to set the entire Galactic Union ablaze. Without hesitation, 11 of the species declared independence from the Galactic Union and formed their own coalition, so to speak. Maybe it was a different word. Something was lost in translation. But it was an open rebellion against the Galactic Union itself for trying to force everyone to heal and become nothing more than their slaves, their servants, their bitches. With this, the Galactic Union began to rally their forces, realizing that it was going to be a single battle. They believed that there was only going to be one single face-off. They would show these new upstarts how to actually fight. They outnumbered them, 24 species to 11. This even counted the 5 slave species that they had, although they didn't expect much of them on the battlefield. Bringing all their ships, they sent out the word almost jubilantly as they looked into the idea of simply wiping out the opposing forces without any single issue. Who could stand against them? They were the Galactic Union. Even by the standards of the old empires, they had the best equipment, as it was fresh off the assembly line. They believed to have the best training, as they drilled many of their people. However, it was true that they had not actually fought a full-on war in several generations now. It didn't matter. They knew that their technology and their straight-up force would be able to mow down any that stand against them, and they would show these young upstarts who was in charge. Above one of the gas giants they waited. Before the fleet even formed up, they had sent out a call for even those of power to watch as they show the young species who really controls the Galactic Union. They could sit back and watch from the far side of one of the gas giant's moons as they take down these simple, backwards species. Most of the rich and powerful of the core worlds would always show up in many of their pleasure yachts as they sat and watched, some of them even being directly behind the front line so they could get, as they said, a good seat, so they could see the destruction of this rebellion happen with their own eyes and not have to watch it on some sort of recording. No, they wanted to be there and they would make a show of it. In many cases, the species did not wear clothing, yet they always had something they got from the humans called a shawl. This simple shawl was a simple piece of cloth, but it was noted the more delicate and the more colorful it was, how bright it could be. This would show how wealthy and how well set they were, especially amongst the females. Amongst the males, they would always dress themselves as colorful and as flamboyant as possible to simply show off their wealth as well. This was something that the younger races never truly understood. The Galactic Union forces stood there waiting, and as they massed, a call went out. If they wanted the commander's head, or simply one of their battle swords. This brought many of the core races to laughter, as they believed it would be a simple matter of watching the rebellious forces get torn to pieces. And as they had their sensors click on, letting them know that the rebellion forces were close, they were waiting for them to jump out of FTL. They knew they couldn't run past them, or else the Galactic Union forces would simply come up behind them and be able to bring their main guns against the engine compartments of the ship, which was, in most likely, a death sentence. So they would have to face them. And as Those ships came out of FTL. They only heard one thing over their comms. Yee yee! Everyone was confused. But as the ships exited FTL in perfect formation, they began to fire as simply the gateways opened to let them back into normal space. Even as the bow just came through, they began to fire. The accuracy of their shots could not be put to side. The first rounds struck most of the ships that they were aiming at, and they watched as the Galactic Union ships were torn to pieces. How was this possible by a single shot? They saw these ships turning as they came through the gate, not even all the way through. They would fire again, taking out another one of the Galactic Union ships. The Galactic Union, very quick to try and rally its forces to line them up, realizing that their lines were not even formed fully yet. Were trying to get everyone in order as they began to charge their turrets to get ready to fire. Then another volley came out. Behind those ships that came out, another bunch of gateways opened, and more species came out. These again in another set of formations that was set up absolutely perfect. It was set up perfectly to cover them, as drones, fighters, corvettes, frigates, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, dreadnoughts filled the skies. The Galactic Union forces shuddered at what they were seeing. These were not backwoods. These were professionals. These were ones that had been drilled for a long time. Their ships looked almost antique. It was though they were never meant for any type of aesthetics. No, these were simple, practical ships. They were simple engines and guns. Some of them flight decks full of drones just loaded with ordnance. As thousands of torpedoes filled the skies, the civilians watched on with horror as the first wave of Galactic Union ships were decimated in front of them. Without skipping a beat, the rebellious forces of the 11 species charged forwards with a strange-looking set of ships up front. It didn't take long for them to realize this was what they remember the humans. The humans like this type of ship, a very boxy, a very practical, and very, very sturdy. Many of their ships were struck, but they just seemed to keep going. It seems as though the mass driver cannons wouldn't do anything. In some cases, they simply ricocheted off the sides. How was this even possible? The mass driver cannons out of the human ships were deadly accurate. The turrets, once they got within optimal firing range, began to fire their energy weapons with unbelievable precision. The fighters were able to duck, dick, and dive all over the place. The drones could even move around, dodging point defense cannons with unbelievable ease, able to drop all sorts of ordnance on, and in some cases spraying some sort of simple devices across the fleet. It wasn't long until they realized what this was. This was magnetic tracking devices. They bugged the ships. As soon as these devices strapped onto the side of one of the ships, it was immediately targeted and was only around for another minute to a minute and a half. And it was only that long because it took a while before a few rounds of ordnance could actually reach them. But the human ships leading the charge did not stop. Their allies joined their battle line, and soon it was a simple wall of ships. Now they began to focus as the formation began to alter itself into a cone shape, with the point of that spear being the largest human ship, what they call a dreadnought. For it fears nothing. It fears not the guns in front of it, nor the debris that follows. It just kept coming. The Galactic Union lines, as they were finally forming, instantly broke at this, as the human ships began to go full burn, going straight towards the center of the Galactic Union. The lines fully broke, and the Union ships began to scatter, trying desperately to get out of the range of the humans' guns. But it wasn't just the humans. They brought many friends. And as the man says in the gunfight, bring a gun, then you bring another gun, And then you bring all your friends with lots of guns. And with that, the Galactic Union forces were broken and scattered, and they began trying to run, trying desperately to get into FTL space, trying to get clear of the gas giants' magnetic fields before they could go. And before they had a chance to even run, they watched in horror as not only the human ships, but anyone close enough began to take pot shots at many of the civilian vessels that were there. The civilians turned and ran, many of them freaking out, completely disregarding their attire as they ran to the helm, trying desperately to get their ships turned away. Many of them begging for help, screaming, "There's children aboard." What the hell were they having children aboard, was all they got in response. But this didn't stop any of the rebellion as it forced them back. It forced them all the way back to their new capital. And as the Galactic Union tried to reform, they thought they could hold. And with that, the rebellion ships continued their onslaught, jumping out of FTL space almost on top of the planet itself, firing everything from their main guns to point defense cannons, continuously blasting. As they did, they aimed their cannons down towards the planet itself, knowing that the anti-ship cannons were going to be ready to fire in less than a minute as soon as they came out. They began to target these cannons and they fired, but they didn't fire with just anything. No, they fired with types of ordnance that made all the other species shudder. They burned everything. They call them Zarbomba rounds. When they struck approximately 30 meters from the surface, or whatever was on top of the surface, the resulting explosion would obliterate everything without exception. Though much cleaner in the way it operated before when it was first used, it was still a nasty weapon. And with that, they burned the entire capital. Along with that, they sent down other ordnance that began to spray a strange mist as it went down. And then halfway down, the ordnance would blow. It would explode, igniting the cloud of air around it. And the resulting explosion was horrific. The shockwave that went through the area knocked every single building down. There was no exceptions. The humans didn't even stop. At one point, there was a few humans that were held in detention centers on the world that was simply a city, the largest city they had. As the ships got close, everyone thought that they would stop, and then they simply asked the humans that they had prisoner, would they stop? Well, if they go by history, they're going to stop, but I'm pretty sure they learn by history. The Galactic Union members didn't understand this. They worried what was going to happen next. Without regard of anything, the rebellion ships fired down on the planet. They took the city apart. They burned everything to the ground. The humans that were inside were seen on video laughing hysterically as the walls began to buckle from the impacts. They could see the walls also turning different colors from the heat that was coming through. And the last one of them said was, "Ha ha, you boys done fucked up," before everything cut off. They had torched not only the capital, but the greatest city. With that, they continued to move forward. They started to aim towards the old capital, where the Galactic Union was first formed. The Galactic Union themselves, realizing that there was not going to be any stopping, they called for a parley, a ceasefire, some way to call for peace. This made the human ships halt. But it wasn't long until they realized why they actually halted, as a new group of signals came in. A whole bunch of transports came in, mostly cargo vessels, and began to transfer things to the dreadnoughts, the battleships, cruisers, and so on. Nobody knew what it was until The human ships moved again, followed very closely by their allies. Everyone realized they were just reloading. The Galactic Union itself surrendered 21 hours later, unconditionally, as they believed that all 24 of their species was going to be completely annihilated. When the humans were asked why they continued on forward, they responded with the same thing another human had said. We learn from history. And later on, a historian would ask one of the soldiers that fought in that war, How were you always ready? I mean, how were you able to do that? How were you able to take down a group that outnumbered you more than 2 to 1 and so effectively? The human, sipping on his ethyl alcohol, simply answered to him, Well, you answered your own question. You know that, right? I do not understand. Could you clarify? Well, rule one in any fight, never, ever underestimate your opponent. Because if you do, well, the results speak for themselves now, don't they?